Ethan stood at the edge of the grave, his hands trembling, his heart pounding like a drum. He had fought for weeks to get the court's permission for this. Tonight, he would finally uncover the truth about his mother's death. "Are you sure about this, Ethan?" asked Detective Harris, his voice low but firm. He had been assigned to oversee the exhumation, though he clearly thought Ethan was chasing ghosts. "Once we open that coffin, there's no going back." Ethan didn't answer. He couldn't. His throat was dry, his mind racing with memories of his mother, her warm smile, her gentle voice, the way she always made him feel safe. But then there was the memory of her funeral, just 6 months ago. The way his father, John, had stood by the grave, his face unreadable, his eyes cold. Something had felt wrong that day. Something had felt off. The shovels hit something solid. The workers stepped back, wiping sweat from their brows. Ethan's breath caught in his chest as the coffin was slowly lifted out of the ground. It was a plain wooden box, nothing fancy. His mother had never cared for extravagance. "Open it," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. The workers hesitated, glancing at Detective Harris. He nodded and they began to unscrew the lid. The sound of the screws turning echoed in the stillness of the night. Ethan's heart was in his throat now. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, suffocating him. The lid came off. The workers stepped back, their faces pale. Detective Harris shone his flashlight into the coffin, and his breath hitched. Ethan stepped forward, his legs like lead, and looked inside. The coffin was empty. Ethan staggered back, his mind reeling. No, this can't be," he gasped. His mother's body was gone. There was no trace of her, no remains, nothing, just an empty coffin. Detective Harris cursed under his breath. "This doesn't make sense." The grave was undisturbed. No one could have tampered with it. Ethan's mind raced. If his mother's body wasn't in the coffin, then where was she? Could she still be alive? The thought sent a shiver down his spine. But if she was alive, why would his father bury an empty coffin? What was he hiding? "We need to call this in," Detective Harris said, pulling out his phone. "This is a crime scene now." Ethan barely heard him. His thoughts were consumed by one burning question. What really happened to my mother? Ethan couldn't sleep that night. The image of the empty coffin haunted him, playing over and over in his mind like a broken record. By dawn, he was back at the police station, sitting across from Detective Harris in a small, dimly lit interrogation room. The detective looked exhausted, his tie loosened, his coffee cup half empty. "We've started the investigation," Harris said, rubbing his temples. "But this isn't going to be easy. Your father's a powerful man, Ethan. He's got connections, money, influence. If he's involved in this, we need solid evidence." Ethan clenched his fists. "He is involved. I know it. My mother didn't just disappear. He did something to her." Harris leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "What makes you so sure? Did you see something? Hear something?" Ethan hesitated. He hadn't told anyone about the argument he'd overheard the night before his mother's death. It had been late, and he'd been on his way to the kitchen for a glass of water when he heard raised voices coming from his parents' bedroom. He'd stopped outside the door, his heart pounding. "You think I don't know about the affair?" his mother had shouted, her voice trembling with anger. "You think I don't know what you're planning?" "Keep your voice down," his father had snapped. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know everything, John. And if you think I'm just going to sit back and let you destroy our family, you're wrong." There had been a loud crash, like something being thrown, and then silence. Ethan had been too scared to open the door. The next morning, his mother had been found dead in her bed. The doctor had said it was a heart attack, but Ethan had always suspected there was more to it. "I heard them arguing," Ethan said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "The night before she died. My father was planning something. I don't know what, but it was bad." Harris nodded slowly, jotting something down in his notebook. "We'll look into it. But for now, I need you to stay out of this, Ethan. Let us handle it." Ethan wanted to argue, but he knew it was pointless. He left the station feeling more lost than ever. As he walked down the street, his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from an unknown number. "Meet me at the old mill. I have something you need to see." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. Who could it be? He glanced around, half expecting to see someone watching him, but the street was empty. He hesitated for a moment, then made up his mind. He had to go. Whatever this was, it might be the clue he'd been searching for. The old mill was on the outskirts of town, a crumbling relic of a bygone era. Ethan parked his car and walked inside, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. The air was thick with dust and the faint smell of rust hung in the air. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. There was no answer. He was about to turn back when he saw it, a small envelope lying on the floor. He picked it up and opened it, his hands shaking. Inside was a single photograph. It was a picture of his mother, alive and well, sitting in a dimly lit room. She looked pale and tired, but she was unmistakably alive. Written on the back of the photo were 3 words: "She's still alive." Ethan's breath caught in his chest. His mother was alive. But where was she? And who had sent him this? Ethan stared at the photograph, his mind racing. His mother's face, so familiar yet so distant, stared back at him. The room in the photo was dark, but he could make out a small window in the background, covered with heavy curtains. It looked like a basement or a storage room, but where? And who had taken the photo? His hands trembled as he flipped the picture over again, reading the words, "She's still alive." The handwriting was messy, hurried, as if the person who wrote it had been in a rush. Ethan's heart pounded. He needed answers, and he needed them now. He pulled out his phone and dialed Detective Harris's number. The detective picked up on the 3rd ring, his voice groggy. "Ethan? It's late. What's going on?" "I got a photo," Ethan blurted out, "of my mom. She's alive. Someone sent it to me." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Where are you?" "The old mill. Someone told me to meet them here, but no one showed up. Just this photo." "Stay there," Harris said firmly. "I'm on my way." Ethan paced the dusty floor of the mill, his mind spinning. Who could have sent the photo? Was it someone who knew the truth about his mother's disappearance? Or was it a trap? He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Minutes later, Detective Harris arrived, his car screeching to a halt outside the mill. He rushed in, his eyes scanning the room. "Show me the photo." Ethan handed it over. Harris studied it carefully, his expression grim. "This changes everything," he muttered. "If your mother's alive, then someone's been lying to us, and I think I know who." Ethan's stomach churned. "My father." Harris nodded. "We need to bring him in for questioning, but we have to be careful. If he's involved in this, he's not going to go down without a fight." The next morning, Ethan sat in the police station, his leg bouncing nervously under the table. Detective Harris had called his father in for questioning, and Ethan had insisted on being there. He needed to see his father's face when he was confronted with the truth. The door opened and John walked in, his face a mask of calm. He was dressed in a sharp suit, his hair perfectly combed, as if he were heading to a business meeting rather than a police interrogation. He glanced at Ethan, his expression unreadable, before sitting down across from Harris. "What's this about, Detective?" John asked, his voice smooth and controlled. Harris slid the photograph across the table. "Care to explain this?" John's eyes flicked to the photo, and for a split second Ethan saw something, a flicker of fear, maybe even panic, cross his father's face. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "I have no idea what this is," John said, pushing the photo back. "It looks like a fake. Someone's trying to stir up trouble." "It's not a fake," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "Mom's alive, and you know where she is." John turned to him, his eyes cold. "Ethan, your mother is dead. You need to accept that and move on." "No," Ethan said, his voice rising. "I don't believe you. You've been lying this whole time. What did you do to her? Where is she?" John's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he stood up, straightening his suit. "If you don't have any real evidence, Detective, I'll be leaving now." Harris sighed, clearly frustrated. "We're not done here, Mr. Carter. Don't leave town." John gave a curt nod and walked out. leaving Ethan and Harris alone in the room. "He's hiding something," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "I know he is." "We'll find out what," Harris said firmly. "But we need more evidence, and I think I know where to start." Later that day, Harris and Ethan arrived at the Carter family home. It was a large, imposing house with tall windows and a perfectly manicured lawn. Ethan hadn't been back since his mother's funeral, and the sight of it made his chest tighten. Harris led the way inside, his badge in hand. "We're here to search the premises," he said to the housekeeper, who looked startled but didn't protest. They started in the study, a room Ethan had always associated with his father. It was filled with books, expensive furniture, and a large mahogany desk. Harris began rifling through the drawers, while Ethan stood by, feeling useless. "What are we looking for?" Ethan asked. "Anything that connects your father to your mother's disappearance," Harris said. "Bank records, phone logs, anything." Ethan's eyes fell on a small, locked drawer in the desk. He'd never noticed it before. "Harris," he said, pointing. "This one's locked." Harris came over and tried the handle. "Stand back," he said, pulling out a small tool. He jimmied the lock open and the drawer slid out. Inside was a stack of papers. Harris pulled them out and began flipping through them. His eyes widened. "Ethan, look at this." Ethan leaned over his shoulder. The papers were property deeds, hundreds of them, and they all bore his mother's name. "What is this?" Ethan asked, confused. "Your father was transferring ownership of your mother's properties," Harris said, his voice grim. "He was planning to sell them, but he couldn't do that while she was alive." Ethan's blood ran cold. "So he faked her death?" "It looks that way," Harris said. "But we still don't know where she is. We need to find her, Ethan, and fast." The discovery of the property deeds sent a chill down Ethan's spine. His father had been planning to sell his mother's assets that legally belonged to her. If she was alive, as the photo suggested, then his father had not only faked her death, but also imprisoned her somewhere. But where? Ethan's mind raced as he and Detective Harris continued searching the house. They combed through every room, every closet, every corner, but found nothing out of the ordinary. The house was immaculate, almost too perfect, as if someone had gone to great lengths to hide any evidence of wrongdoing. "There's got to be something we're missing," Ethan muttered, frustration bubbling up inside him. He wouldn't just keep her out in the open, he's too careful for that. Harris nodded, his expression grim. "Let's check the basement. If there's anywhere he could hide something or someone, it's down there." The basement door was tucked away in a corner of the kitchen, partially hidden behind a large cabinet. Ethan had never paid much attention to it before. His father had always told him it was just storage space, filled with old furniture and boxes. But now, as he stood in front of the door, he felt a strange sense of dread. Harris pulled the door open, revealing a steep staircase leading down into darkness. He flicked on the light switch, but nothing happened. "Great," he muttered, pulling out a flashlight. "Stay close." The two of them descended the stairs, the beam of Harris's flashlight cutting through the gloom. The air was damp and cold, and the smell of mildew hung heavy in the air. The basement was cluttered with boxes, old furniture, and tools, just as Ethan's father had always said. But something felt off. "Look," Harris said, shining the light on the far wall. There was a door, partially hidden behind a stack of boxes. It was heavy and metal, with a large padlock on the handle. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "That wasn't here before," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've never seen that door." Harris moved the boxes aside and examined the padlock. "It's new," he said, pulling out his tools. "Someone's been using this recently." He worked quickly, picking the lock with practiced ease. The padlock clicked open, and Harris pulled the door open, revealing a narrow hallway. The air inside was even colder, and the smell of damp earth was overwhelming. "Stay behind me," Harris said, stepping into the hallway. Ethan followed, his heart pounding in his chest. The hallway led to a small, dimly lit room. The walls were bare concrete, and the floor was covered in a thin layer of dirt. In the center of the room was a cot, and on the cot lay a woman. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It was his mother, She was thin and pale, her hair matted and unkempt. Her eyes were closed, and she looked so fragile, so unlike the strong, vibrant woman Ethan remembered. But it was her. There was no doubt about it. "Mom," Ethan whispered, rushing to her side. He knelt beside the cot, gently taking her hand in his. Her skin was cold, but he could feel a faint pulse in her wrist. She was alive. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at him, confusion and fear in her gaze. "Ethan?" she croaked, her voice weak and hoarse. "Is that really you?" Tears streamed down Ethan's face as he nodded. "It's me, Mom. I'm here. You're safe now." Harris was already on his phone, calling for an ambulance and backup. "We need to get her out of here," he said, his voice urgent. "She needs medical attention." Ethan helped his mother sit up, supporting her frail body as she struggled to move. She was weak, but alive, and that was all that mattered. "How long have you been down here?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," she whispered. "Days. Weeks. I lost track. Your father. He—" She trailed off, her eyes filling with tears. "It's okay," Ethan said, holding her close. "You don't have to talk about it right now. We're going to get you out of here." As they made their way back up the stairs, Ethan's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Relief that his mother was alive, anger at his father for what he'd done, and a burning determination to make sure he paid for his crimes. The ambulance arrived quickly, and Ethan watched as his mother was loaded into the back, her frail body wrapped in a blanket. Harris stayed behind to secure the scene while Ethan climbed into the ambulance, holding his mother's hand as they sped toward the hospital. "I'm so sorry, Mom," Ethan said, his voice breaking. "I should have known. I should have done something sooner." She shook her head weakly. "It's not your fault, Ethan. Your father? He's a dangerous man. I tried to stop him, but—" She trailed off, her eyes closing as exhaustion overtook her. Ethan's jaw tightened. His father had done this. He had locked his own wife in a basement, faked her death, and tried to steal her property. And for what? Money? Power? It didn't matter. Ethan would make sure he paid for what he'd done. The hospital room was quiet, save for the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Ethan sat by his mother's bedside, holding her hand as she slept. She looked so fragile, so different from the strong woman he remembered. But she was alive, and that was all that mattered. Detective Harris had called earlier to update him. The police had issued a warrant for John's arrest, but he was nowhere to be found. He had vanished, leaving behind no trace of where he might have gone. Harris assured Ethan they were doing everything they could to find him, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of unease. His father was a smart man, and if he didn't want to be found, he wouldn't be. Ethan's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was a text from an unknown number. "If you want answers, meet me at the cabin. Come alone." Ethan's heart raced. The cabin. It was a small, secluded property his family owned in the woods, a place they used to visit when he was a child. His father had always loved it there, calling it his escape. If he was anywhere, that's where he'd be. Ethan hesitated. He knew he should call Harris, tell him about the text. But what if his father saw the police and ran? What if he disappeared for good? Ethan couldn't risk it. He had to go alone. He stood up, gently squeezing his mother's hand. "I'll be back soon, Mom," he whispered. "I promise." The drive to the cabin was a blur. Ethan's mind was racing, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The woods were dense and dark, the narrow road barely visible in the fading light. When he finally reached the cabin, the sun had set, leaving the forest cloaked in shadows. The cabin looked just as he remembered it, small and rustic, with a porch that creaked under his weight as he stepped onto it. The door was slightly ajar, and a faint light flickered from inside. Ethan pushed the door open, his heart pounding. "Dad?" he called out, his voice trembling. The cabin was dimly lit, the only light coming from a single lamp on the table. John sat in a chair by the fireplace, his back to the door. He didn't turn around as Ethan entered. "I knew you'd come," John said, his voice calm and measured. You always were a stubborn kid." Ethan stepped closer, his fists clenched at his sides. "Where is she, Dad? Where's Mom?" John finally turned to face him, his expression unreadable. "She's safe. For now." Ethan's blood boiled. "Safe? You locked her in a basement. You faked her death. How is that safe?" John sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You don't understand, Ethan. You never did. Your mother. She was going to ruin everything. She found out about the affair, about the property deals. She was going to expose me, take everything I'd worked for. So you tried to kill her?" Ethan shouted, his voice echoing in the small cabin. "She's your wife. How could you do that?" John's eyes narrowed, his calm demeanor cracking for the first time. "You think this was easy for me? You think I wanted to do this? I had no choice, Ethan. She left me no choice." Ethan shook his head, tears of anger and disbelief streaming down his face. "You're a monster. You don't deserve to call yourself my father." John stood up, his face hardening. "You don't get it, do you? This is the real world, Ethan. It's not some fairy tale where everyone gets a happy ending. Sometimes you have to make hard choices." "Hard choices?" Ethan spat. "You tried to kill her. You buried an empty coffin. What kind of choice is that?" John took a step closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you're so righteous, don't you? But you're just like me, Ethan. Deep down you know it. You'd do whatever it takes to protect what's yours." Ethan shook his head, backing away. "I'm nothing like you, and I'm not going to let you get away with this." John smirked, a cold, calculating smile that sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. "You really think you can stop me? You're just a kid, Ethan. You always have been." Before Ethan could respond, John lunged at him, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him against the wall. Ethan struggled, but his father was stronger, his grip like iron. "You should have stayed out of this," John hissed, his face inches from Ethan's. "But since you couldn't, I'll have to take care of you too." Ethan's mind raced. He had to do something, anything. He kicked out, his foot connecting with John's knee. John grunted in pain, his grip loosening just enough for Ethan to break free. Ethan stumbled back, his chest heaving. "It's over, Dad. The police are on their way. You're not going to get away with this." John's eyes widened, and for the first time Ethan saw a flicker of fear in them. "You called the police?" Ethan shook his head. "Number, but they're coming, and when they get here you're going to pay for what you've done." John's face twisted in rage, and he lunged at Ethan again. But this time Ethan was ready. He sidestepped, grabbing a heavy candlestick from the table and swinging it with all his might. It connected with John's head, and he crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Ethan stood over him, his hands trembling, the candlestick still clutched in his grip. He felt a surge of emotions, relief, anger, sadness, but most of all he felt a sense of finality. It was over. The sound of sirens echoed through the woods, growing louder with each passing second. Ethan dropped the candlestick and stepped outside, his legs shaking as he waited for the police to arrive. It was over. His father would pay for what he'd done. And his mother. She was safe. That was all that mattered. The police arrived in a flurry of flashing lights and shouting voices. Detective Harris was the first to reach Ethan, his face a mix of relief and concern. "Are you okay?" he asked, gripping Ethan's shoulder. Ethan nodded, though he felt anything but okay. His hands were still shaking and his mind was a whirlwind of emotions. "He's inside," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's unconscious." Harris nodded and motioned for the officers to move in. They rushed into the cabin, their guns drawn, and moments later they emerged with John in handcuffs. He was groggy, blood trickling from a cut on his forehead, but he was alive. His eyes met Ethan's as they led him to the police car, and for a brief moment Ethan saw something in them. Regret, maybe, or sorrow. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by the cold, hard mask Ethan had come to know so well. As the police car drove away, taking his father with it, Ethan felt a strange mix of relief and emptiness. It was over. His father would face justice for what he'd done. But the scars of the past few months, the lies, the betrayal, the fear, would take much longer to heal. The next few days were a blur. Ethan spent most of his time at the hospital, sitting by his mother's bedside as she recovered. She was weak, but the doctor said she would make a full recovery with time. She had been through hell, but she was alive, and that was all that mattered to Ethan. One afternoon, as the sun streamed through the hospital window, his mother reached out and took his hand. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice still hoarse but stronger than before. "Thank you for not giving up on me." Tears filled Ethan's eyes as he squeezed her hand. "I could never give up on you, Mom. I love you." She smiled, her eyes shining with tears of her own. "I love you too, Ethan, more than anything." Detective Harris visited the hospital a few days later to update them on the case. John had been charged with attempted murder, fraud, and a host of other crimes. The evidence against him was overwhelming: the property deeds, the empty coffin, the basement where he'd kept Ethan's mother hidden. He was facing life in prison, and there was no chance of him getting out. "It's over," Harris said, his voice gentle. "He can't hurt you anymore." Ethan nodded, but he knew it wasn't really over. The scars of what his father had done would stay with him forever. But he also knew that he and his mother would get through it together. They had each other, and that was enough. A few weeks later, Ethan and his mother moved into a small house on the outskirts of town. It was nothing like the grand home they'd lived in before, but it was warm and safe, and that was all that mattered. They spent their days rebuilding their lives, one step at a time. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Ethan turned to his mother. "Do you ever think about him?" he asked, his voice quiet. She was silent for a moment, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "Sometimes," she said finally, "but not in the way you might think. I don't miss him. I don't hate him. I just feel sorry for him. He had everything, and he threw it all away for nothing." Ethan nodded, understanding. He felt the same way. His father had been a man consumed by greed and ambition, and in the end, it had destroyed him. "But we're free now," his mother said, turning to him with a smile. "And that's what matters. We have each other, and we have a chance to start over." That's more than he ever had. Ethan smiled back, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. They had been through hell, but they had come out the other side. And as they sat there, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Ethan knew that they would be okay. The story of Ethan and his mother was one of betrayal, loss, and ultimately, redemption. It was a story of a son's love for his mother, and a mother's strength in the face of unimaginable cruelty. And though the scars of the past would never fully fade, they served as a reminder of what they had overcome, and the new beginning they had fought so hard to achieve.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.